War. It is perhaps the most important thing that international relations scholars study. That is because war, and the preparations made to go to war, are basically the most expensive endeavors that mankind engages in. And yet, so much about war is misunderstood, and some facts that people think that they know about war are actually flat out wrong. Well, today, we're going to try to rectify some of the knowledge gap there. Let me begin by giving you a broad outline of what we are going to cover today. We're going to begin by discussing various different types of explanations for war that one might study, and why we are going to, in this particular lecture, narrow it down to just one type, and save the other types of explanations perhaps for later on in this series. Then I am going to define the central inefficiency puzzle of war. This is a very strong result that is very general, and gives us a puzzle as researchers that we need to confront if we want to try to understand why wars occur. The inefficiency puzzle is that, in principle, there should always be settlements that two sides prefer to fighting a war, and as a consequence, if we observe two sides fighting a war, we then have a puzzle on our hands. Why is it that those two sides chose to fight as their conflict resolution mechanism, instead of negotiate instead? Usually, the type of answer that you will hear to that question is that any deal that one side is willing to make is a deal that the other side is unwilling to accept. But, again, as I hope to show you in a moment, what we're going to see is that that's not true. There should always, in fact, be settlements that both sides prefer to war. And so what we'll do with the rest of this lecture is try to explain why states may prefer fighting a war, given that there should be a consensus understanding by both parties that those types of settlements exist. And the answers that we're going to focus on in this lecture are threefold. The first category is commitment problems as a consequence of shifting power. The second is asymmetric information and miscalculation. And the third is issue indivisibility. We'll spend quite a bit of time looking at those first two buckets and seeing that there's ample empirical evidence to suggest that these explanations are very good answers to that inefficiency puzzle. And then I'll spend quite a bit of time on that third explanation, telling you why on the surface it may appear appealing, but when we get down to it and we start trying to look for empirical cases, it becomes a little bit murkier, and in fact, things are relatively easy to divide if the parties are willing to come to an agreement, and if they're not willing to come to an agreement, then perhaps the other two explanations are going to do a better job of us understanding why. But first, we have to look at a different set of categories, namely the frameworks that we could be investigating to try to understand why wars occur. And we have two different things that we could be looking at, and a binary choice in both of those cases. So on one level, looking at the rows, we could be thinking about the state system, whether we're focusing on states as unitary actors or states as non-unitary actors. A unitary actor here would be trying to understand, for example, why the United States fights a war against Venezuela, or why Ukraine and Russia fight a war, where we're thinking about those as singular entities getting involved in conflicts with one another. Whereas, in contrast, a non-unitary actor explanation for war might try to look inside of a country. Why are the incentives that perhaps Vladimir Putin faces inside of Russia driving him to get involved in a conflict with Ukraine? Meanwhile, on the columns, we have to decide whether we want to have a rational or an irrational framing. Unlike unitary and non-unitary actor explanations, rationality and irrationality have everyday meaning. So what you think of as rational or irrational is going to get you 85% of the way there in what we're going to try to mean in this lecture and in this general course. However, in social sciences, rationality and irrationality have a very specific meaning, which does in fact break from the colloquial use of those words. So we're going to have to get a little bit more careful with those in a second. For now, though, I want to situate you with what we're going to be looking at today versus what we're going to discuss later on in this course. Our focus for today is on rational unitary actor explanations. So these are going to be pairs of countries where we're thinking about the countries as a whole, the United States versus Venezuela, Russia versus Ukraine, Israel versus Iran, and so forth. And each of those countries is thinking through the consequences of their action and trying to do the best that they can given the circumstances that they find themselves in. That's by and large, what a rational unitary actor explanation is. In a future lecture, we will spend ample time discussing rational, non-unitary actor explanations for war. These are going to focus on the leaders, where we have leaders thinking about situations strategically and trying to maximize their outcomes given the circumstances that they face. So they're still acting rationally, but they're also cognizant of the fact that their own personal incentives might differ from the rest of their populations. And those leaders, therefore, might want to exploit a war for their own benefit to the detriment of the rest of their people. Through that process, we will touch upon irrational, non-unitary actor explanations for war, which I have summarized on your screen as behavioral manipulation. You can think about these things as leaders understanding that they're trying to get good outcomes for themselves, perhaps at the cost of their own population, using the behavioral characteristics of the population to exploit that population to the detriment of the population and the betterment of the leader. The final category that we have left to cover is irrational unitary actor explanations, which I have labeled as overrated and misunderstood. That is not to say that these irrational unitary actor explanations for war never happen. I'm not saying that. What I am saying, however, is that there is a tendency by the public and by what you might think of as low-quality analysis to say, there's a war, it just happened, that's crazy. The actors involved in this war are behaving crazily. Those leaders are not very good at their jobs, and while those leaders are trying not to manipulate their population, they're trying to do the best thing for their country, they're just really bad at actually executing that. And that's the reason why a war occurred. I think the reason that those explanations are popular is because they're just really easy to espouse. Anyone can say that. It's pretty easy to make those sorts of claims, and you don't really have to think too much more about what's happening in the world to suggest that is why a particular war is happening. And again, could that type of thing happen out there in the real world? Yes, but I think we need to be more careful about using that sort of explanation because, again, it is overrated, misunderstood, and certainly overused. And that provides a nice transition into why we're starting off in this lecture with rational unitary actor explanations. And I need to justify that in two different steps. One on why we should begin by focusing on rational explanations instead of irrational explanations, and then later why we should start by focusing on unitary actor explanations instead of non-unitary actor explanations. Let's start with the rational versus irrational dichotomy, and circle back to the idea that the way that we use those words in the social sciences is different than the way that we use those words in everyday English. In colloquial use, the word irrational could be used as a synonym for crazy. And sometimes that will follow through in social sciences as well, but that's not inherently the case. Alternatively, in, again, everyday English use, we might use the word irrational to mean weird. And that is where this starts to become a clear problem for social sciences. Imagine that you found a leader in some far-flung country who had a singular goal to take over the entire world and then cull half of the population, carve out their brains, and eat them mixed in with some worms. That is utterly bizarre. I think you and I would agree on that. I think your average social scientist would also say that that is particularly bizarre. In everyday English use, we would say that that person is probably acting pretty irrationally. But we as social scientists would not use the word irrational in the way that we define irrationality here on that particular person. That person may or may not be irrational, and purely the idea that they want to kill half the population and eat brains with worms is not evidence inherently of irrationality. Now, in terms of the social sciences definition of irrationality, there are a couple of different levels here. Let's start with the basic one. Imagine that I gave you 3 countries, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, and I asked you to rank those 3 countries. Do you like Russia or Ukraine more? Do you like Ukraine or the United States more? Do you like the United States or Russia more? Someone who is irrational will have one of 2 flaws here, again from the social sciences definition. Someone who is unable to answer that question, if you ask them, do you prefer Ukraine or the United States, and they kind of just shrugged their shoulders and did not have an answer to that question, That is, in part, how we would define irrationality in the social sciences. You have to be capable of answering that type of question, otherwise you are irrational. And to be clear here, indifference is perfectly fine. You are allowed to say, I am indifferent between Ukraine and the United States. I do not have a preference between the two. I do not like the United States more. I do not like Ukraine more. I like them equally as much. Indifference is fine. Where we draw the line, though, is the shrugging of the shoulders. You have to be able to answer that question one way or another or equal to. The other way that you could run into a problem is with an absurdity that may arise in how they are actually answering those questions. Listen closely. Imagine that person tells you that they prefer Russia to Ukraine, they prefer Ukraine to the United States, and they prefer the United States to Russia. Do you see the problem here? Imagine you ask that person, what's your favorite country? How are they going to respond to that question? They probably can't provide a good answer. They can't tell you that their favorite country is, for example, Ukraine, because they like Russia more than they like Ukraine. They can't tell you that their favorite country is Russia because they like the United States more than they like Russia. And they can't tell you that the United States is their favorite country because they like Ukraine more than the United States. This creates what is known as a preference cycle. There is no top choice here. Something is always better than something else, but that creates an absurdity like I just said. You can't have a favorite here if something is always beating something else, but then something else is better than that thing, but then the thing that was really bad at the start is actually the best thing, but no, it's the worst thing. You can see where this logic is going. In fact, it's not going anywhere. It's illogical. Usually, when you hear someone say that a war started as a consequence of one of the parties behaving irrationally, they're not referring to some sort of cycle in the preference ordering or inability to answer whether the actor likes A or B, or is indifferent between the two. Usually, instead, it's some sort of argument that the preference itself is strange from the perspective of the individual who is doing the analysis. And we see this most clearly with what's happening with the Kremlin and the war between Russia and Ukraine. How many times have you heard an analyst say that the Kremlin is acting irrationally? And the evidence for that is that the Kremlin is spending a whole bunch of money and spilling a whole bunch of blood to try to take over portions of Ukraine. And from the perspective of anyone in the West or anyone in the sane world, the costs associated with that are just not worth it. The value of Ukrainian territory is not nearly worth the amount of lives lost or the amount of money wasted on that endeavor. Well, given the social sciences definition I just gave you, there's nothing inherently irrational about that. Nor was there anything inherently irrational about that weird leader from a moment ago who wanted to eat brains with worms. Yeah, it's very strange perhaps to us, but if that's what that leader likes, then that's fine as long as that's their preference ordering. And as long as they have a consistent set of preferences that rank something at the highest and something at the lowest. I know that there is a temptation to fire back at me and say, well, that's just an academic distinction, and it has no real meaning in the real world. When you're actually fighting a war and you're looking at an actor that's like this, yeah, that person is crazy, they're irrational, and your social sciences definition is meaningless for that purpose. Well, please hold your judgment for a moment, because by the end of this lecture, I am going to show you that even if you have a leader that has a crazy preference like that, crazy with quotation marks here, that does not actually get us to explaining why wars occur. The second level of irrationality in social sciences, and a stronger level at that, is basically a synonym for astrategic. So you could have an individual that has well-formed preferences, even if they are, quote, weird, end quote. They can put something at the top of a list that they like the most. They can put something at the bottom of the list that they like the least. They can rank everything else in between. They're fine on that metric. But then when it comes to actually trying to implement a strategy that takes them from that preference ordering to achieving outcomes on that preference ordering, they all fall apart. Now, that social sciences definition of irrationality does a much better job of matching up with some of the discussion in news articles about war and irrationality. For example, you might read something that says something along the lines of, yeah, not only does Putin have those crazy preferences of wanting to capture lots of Europe, even though it's not worth the cost, Putin is also just bad at implementing strategies that get him to those outcomes. So he can write down a preference ordering, which you and I see as weird. But in addition to that, he can't actually look at strategies that are put in front of him and implement those strategies in a way that is coherent and reasonable. To give you an illustration of what that might look like, imagine that Putin receives an intelligence report that says that there is a 10% chance that Russia will be successful in Ukraine. And Putin looks at that report and says, well, no, that can't be right. Either we will be successful or we will not be successful. It either will be the case or it won't be the case. So there's a 50-50 chance. It either is or it isn't. That would be astrategically irrational. Or maybe instead of that response, Putin just dismisses the report as being inaccurate because he feels like it is wrong. He doesn't actually have any good way of explaining why it is wrong. He's just going with his gut feeling. He's refusing to take a look at what's going on in the world, looking at the information that's put in front of him, and changing his beliefs accordingly. That, again, would be astrategically irrational. Once again, I, as a social scientist, am not here to tell you that that never happens. It may very well happen. It's going to be hard for me as a social scientist to identify it when it does happen, because I would kind of need to be in the room as it happens to see these sorts of bizarre miscalculations as they are ongoing. Or I need to find some sort of reliable inside source that was there at the time that it happened and does not have any sort of ulterior motive to paint that particular individual as being crazy, either because they're trying to get some sort of political gain for themselves or that leader fell out of favor and so they're trying to make themselves look good in retrospect, that they were the sane individual in the room and that everyone else was crazy. Rather, the main point that I want to make in part in this lecture, and later on when we have a lecture on rational non-unitary actor explanations, is that a lot of the outcomes that we observe in the real world, and then that media or some analysts will portray as occurring as a consequence of irrational behavior, may very well be the consequence of rational thought processes that, from the outsider's perspective, look a little bit nuts in retrospect. Part of that is that we get the benefit of retrospective. They don't. When they have to make decisions on the fly, they're not going to have as much information as we do well after the fact. And so it's going to be much easier for us to say retrospectively, wow, there was a mistake made here. Look at all this information that we know. It is very obvious now that they should not have engaged in that particular activity. They should not have started that war because it was going to backfire. But that does not inherently mean that the leader made an error in the moment, given the information the leader had when it was time to make the decision. This is sort of like being in Las Vegas and having a roulette wheel come up red, and you bet black. I can't go to you and say, hey, you idiot, why did you bet on black? It came up red. Well, you didn't know that it was going to come up red at the time. And so to criticize you retrospectively on that is a little bit absurd. And similarly, we will see cases before the end of today's lecture where, given the information that the leader had at the time, it might have made sense to go ahead and get involved in a war, even though retrospectively, again, after the fact, we as analysts would look at that and say, well, that was a miscalculation there. Then the other version of irrationality might be along the lines of, the leader had this intelligence that said that this would be a bad idea, and the leader did it anyway. But what we'll ultimately see is that the leader was doing it not because the leader was trying to maximize the state outcome, but had some sort of selfish interest in pursuing this particular policy. And so the intelligence report was not important, and it was not pertinent to the decision in the way that it might have been pertinent to the decision for someone who was better representative of the state preferences. That individual, that leader who has the bias, might look at this situation where there's a 10% chance of success and think to themselves, yeah, that's a good idea, even though anyone in the public would be like, no, that's an absolutely awful idea. It's just that the leader really benefits from this outcome for whatever reason, and so they are willing to take risks that the average individual inside of the country is unwilling to take. That does not mean that the leader is irrational. That just means that the leader has a biased preference that is going against the wishes of the rest of the population in that particular country. Unfortunately, that's not something that we're going to be delving deep into in this lecture. We will see that eventually in future lectures when we address those rational, non-unitary actor explanations for war. Pulling together some of the pieces of this discussion, and actually to conclude this discussion on rationality versus irrationality. The reason that we're focusing on rational explanations for war first is that what defines irrational explanations for war is the absence of rationality. So if we want to understand what irrationality looks like, we first have to master what rationality looks like, understand where rationality can take us, and then once we have a working knowledge of that, only then can we really explore irrational explanations for war. Meantime, it's a similar sort of story why we are beginning with unitary actor explanations for war, and then shifting over to non-unitary actor explanations for war. If we want to understand how leaders screw things up, as it were, Well, that presupposes that things would not be screwed up if not for the leader, which means we need to have the leaderless world as some sort of baseline, and then extend from that baseline to having more complicated scenarios in front of us, namely by having leaders added to the mix and have those leaders have some sort of preference divergence from the rest of their population. And I have 2 extra notes on that. 1, this is good advice from a broader social science perspective in trying to understand the logic of how any environment works. You don't want to start with the most complicated environment possible. You want to start off with the simplest, stripped-down environment, get a masterful understanding about how that simplified world works, and then slowly integrate extra bells and whistles to the system, to the model of behavior. And so here that means we're starting off with these unitary actors, because that's going to be the simpler case. And after we have a mastery of that, then we can start to integrate more moving parts. We'll actually see a version of this later on in this lecture itself, when we begin with a static environment where everyone knows what the balance of power looks like, and there is no shifting power over time. And then later, once we have a mastery over that, then we'll add extra bells and whistles, like a lack of knowledge of what the balance of power looks like, or having shifting power over time. Again, start simple, and then build up from there. The other point is that leaders, by and large, when they are trying to start a war, will frame things in terms of rational, unitary actor explanations. And so if we want to test the logic that leaders are giving us and see if they make sense or if they're just full of it, then we need to be masters of those rational unitary actor frameworks and understand why wars do or do not occur under them. When leaders try to rally political support or rally the troops on the eve of a war, they will say things like, "I am fighting this war on behalf of all of us. This is going to improve all of our lives. We are going to collectively pay a cost, but it will be worth it to all of us. Because that other country over there, they're trying to take advantage of us. They are going to grow more powerful over time, and they are going to become an increasing danger to us, and we need to do something about it collectively as a whole in this country to stop our antagonists from taking advantage of us even worse." What you will not hear are things like, well, the media currently is focused on a scandal involving an intern named Monica Lewinsky, and I would really like it if they would stop talking about that. So to distract the media, I'm going to bomb a pharmaceutical plant in Sudan with some ties to some embassy bombings in Africa, and the media will focus on that, and then I'll have some better press, or at least neutral press, about me, rather than having a focus nonstop on some sort of scandal that looks really bad for me instead. You also won't hear a leader say, well, the economic situation in this country isn't looking so hot, but I do have strong national security credentials. So let me go start another war, that way the focus among the American population is on the war and not the economy. As another example, you will never hear a leader say, well, currently the media is looking into connections that I have with someone named Jeffrey Epstein, and I really don't like that. So rather than have the media focus on that sort of thing, instead I am going to strike some boats nearby Venezuela that I allege to be cartel boats that are running drugs, so that there is a broader conflict between the United States and Venezuela, and then the media will focus on that rather than my connections to Epstein. You will never hear leaders say those kinds of things. And so if we want to test the logics that leaders actually give us, then once more, we have to be masters of rational unitary actor explanations. And that, again, is why we are starting there. So let's now get into the main puzzle of rational unitary actor explanations. And I'm going to do this in 2 parts. First, with a visual motivating example using what we know about what's happening in Ukraine, and then we will generalize the logic that I'm doing here visually with a little bit of clean mathematics that will further clarify that this is in fact a very general result and not something that's relegated to just Ukraine, never mind just territorial conflicts. Well, imagine that we are in the midst of a crisis or on the eve of one. Then we have 2 sides, each deciding how to resolve their differences. Broadly speaking, option 1 is to do so at the bargaining table. Negotiate an agreement, sign it, and then implement it. Option 2 is to let everyone's differences be resolved on the battlefield. The 2 armies fight, and then whoever is left over is what determines who is going to get what. Okay, here's the first important point. What can happen at the bargaining table is a function of expectations of what might happen on the battlefield. You are not going to be able to get both parties to commit to an agreement if one of them thinks that they can do better by fighting. In other words, both parties have to be satisfied in order to convince them to resolve their differences at the bargaining table rather than on the battlefield. Let's dig deeper into this. Both sides can consult their respective militaries and intelligence agencies to get a grasp of what might happen if they fight a war. And as you can see here, I have plotted a hypothetical expected outcome between the two parties, here Ukraine and Russia. Now, I do not actually know what that looks like in practice, but in principle, these are things that leaders should be able to do. And in fact, a lot of what goes on in military planning is exactly that. Trying to wargame various different scenarios and get a grasp of what might happen on the battlefield and how likely each party is to be successful. So I do not have to know exactly what that expected outcome is from each of their perspectives to say that we can, in principle, think about these sorts of things, to also comment that the leaders themselves have to work through these things and do, in fact, work through these things, and that ultimately, if we're thinking about a strict territorial conflict between Ukraine and Russia, would result in some sort of division of territory between the two of them if you have a war be fought. And of course, this expected outcome might be an expectation over many different things that could happen. There's some chance, perhaps, that Ukraine will completely destroy the Russian military and allow Ukraine to keep all of its territorial sovereignty. On the flip side, it's also possible that Russia might be able to completely destroy all of Ukraine, or at least the governance of Ukraine, and take over all of that territory as well. And of course, there's some middle outcomes there too. But if you average them all together, you get this expected outcome here, hypothetically. And I keep saying hypothetically because, once more, I do not know that this is actually what it looks like in practice. But, simultaneously, I, as an analyst, don't need to know exactly what that looks like to be able to make some powerful claims about what the parties should be able to do, conditional on them understanding these sorts of things. And that's a big level up if you're trying to become a social scientist. You don't have to know everything that people on the ground know to be able to make claims about what people on the ground who do know these things should be able to do with that knowledge. The only other assumption that I need to make to be able to draw a pretty powerful conclusion is that war is costly. And that should be relatively uncontroversial. If a war starts, people are going to die. Buildings are going to be destroyed. Economies are going to be completely distorted to outputting military goods instead of more productive things like infrastructure. All of those things are losses, disutilities that are put into the system for each of the parties, conditional on a war occurring, that would not happen if there were a negotiated resolution instead. As you can see, I have plotted the costs for both parties as going away from the expected outcome of war. So Russia's costs are represented by the space between the white and the red lines, and Ukraine's costs are represented by the space between the yellow and the white lines. I have two notes about that. First, the costlier war is for one of the parties, the larger that space is going to be. So for Russia, if suddenly the costs of war become much larger for the country, that red line is going to shift eastward, and there will be a larger gap between the white and the red lines. Same thing for Ukraine going the other way. The larger Ukraine's costs of war are, the further that yellow line is going to shift west, and the larger the space will be between the yellow and white lines. The second point is more subtle. Each of these costs implicitly includes how much the respective party cares about the territory that is being fought versus the value of human lives that are going to be lost in the event of a war. In international relations, we call this nebulous concept resolve. A party is more resolved if they care more about the stakes, and therefore they are more willing to sacrifice their own human lives to be able to save the thing that is at stake. For example, think about a comparison between Florida and the Philippines. The United States cares about the protection of both to some degree. However, the United States is more willing to spill blood to save Florida than it is the Philippines, in large part because Florida is a part of the United States and the Philippines is not. So if you held constant the number of US casualties that would be incurred to save each of them at, say, 100,000, the United States might be willing to do that for Florida, but would be unwilling to do that for the Philippines. And that is because resolve interacts with the actual physical costs of war, and the more resolved you are, the less you are going to internalize those costs. Going back to the map, the way that we would visualize this is as follows. If Ukraine, for example, were very resolved over the issues at stake, that yellow line would start getting closer and closer to the white line. Because even if Ukraine is paying the exact same cost in terms of human lives and perhaps money, the way that Ukraine is internalizing those losses is relatively low, precisely because it cares a whole bunch about the issues at stake. And if you flip-flop everything, well, it goes in reverse. Now the yellow line is going to be going further out if Ukraine is less resolved, because Ukraine does not care very much about the issues at stake, and thus is more willing to negotiate over them. And just as a final thought here, this is the type of thing that governments have to commonly do. And indeed, in the United States, there's an explicit rule about this. In the United States, the value of a human life is worth $13 million, or thereabouts. It depends on the year, it changes every year, but that is how much, roughly speaking, the United States values one human life inside of the United States. Usually, that is used to calculate things like whether to make traffic improvements that will save lives and how much it will cost to make those improvements versus how many lives it will save. But just as easily, it can be applied to things like, say, military action. The important thing about all of this, though, is that we can pull it all together and draw a pretty important conclusion. Think about what that red line actually represents. I know previously I said that the distance between the white and red lines represents Russia's costs of war. But that white line is the expected outcome of war, and if we deduct those costs, moving the white line effectively eastward and drawing it as a red line instead, so we're shifting that white line exactly by the length of those costs, what that red line, a literal red line on your screen, represents is the figurative red line from Russia's perspective in negotiations. Again, if we're thinking about this purely as a territorial conflict, and Russia is just trying to maximize the quantity of territory that it gets, net the costs associated with fighting to acquire that territory. The white line is what Russia expects to acquire, and the distance between the white and the red lines are the losses that Russia suffers by trying to acquire that stuff via war. So thus, that red line is the minimum that Russia needs to receive in a negotiated settlement to prefer that negotiated settlement to what it could get by fighting. Because if it receives anything less, Russia could reject that and, in expectation, do better by fighting a war, getting an expected outcome to the white line, and even net its costs, everything between the white and the red line, still doing better than what the proposal suggests. In turn, Russia would reject any negotiated settlements proposed to the right of the red line and accept anything to the left of the red line. And we can have the exact same logic, but kind of reversed for Ukraine. Ukraine's expected outcome is everything to the left of the white line. Net its costs is everything to the left of the yellow line. Thus, in negotiations, Ukraine's red line here is actually its yellow line. Ukraine needs to hold on to at least everything up until the yellow line to prefer that settlement to fighting a war. Because if we try drawing something to the west of the yellow line, Ukraine could reject it, fight, get an expected outcome to the white line, and even net its costs, going back to the yellow line, do better than what that proposal is supposed to give Ukraine. Consequently, Ukraine would prefer to accept any settlement to the right of the yellow line, and again, reject everything to the left of the yellow line. But put those two pieces of information together, what Russia is willing to do and what Ukraine is willing to do. Any division that is drawn between the yellow and the red lines is mutually preferable to war. The reason being is that such divisions roughly match the expected outcome, but as a consequence of being a negotiated settlement, something that is done peacefully, does not entail having to pay any costs associated with war. So both parties do better because they are mimicking the outcome of a war without actually fighting the war. So we call the set of possible settlements between the yellow and red lines the bargaining range. That is because this is the set that is mutually preferable to war, but simultaneously conditional on not fighting. Each party has diametrically opposed preferences at which division that we arrive at. Russia would like to take things as close to the yellow line as possible, whereas Ukraine would like to take things as close to the red line as possible. But this is what they should be bargaining over because they should be trying to avoid wars to avoid paying those costs. Perhaps now you can see why there's an interesting research question here. Why would states fight wars when they could settle inside of the bargaining range and both do better as a consequence? Well, that is what we want to try to answer with the rest of this lecture. One possible answer to that question is that there was something that was weird about the way that we constructed this specific case. So the first step to make sure that we actually have a good question here is to understand that this is in fact a generalizable result. This is not something that is unique to the specific situation that I drew here. And to be able to actually show that it generalizes, we're going to have to do a little bit of algebra and be a little bit more rigorous with our math and how we're demonstrating this war's inefficiency puzzle research question. It turns out that demonstrating the generalizability of that result is not that difficult. I only need to introduce to you 4 variables and do a little bit of basic algebra to get there. So what I'm going to do now is go through a little bit of notation, then look at what each side expects to get by fighting a war versus negotiating a resolution instead. Doing that will give us a couple of constraints that we can combine together to demonstrate that a bargaining range should always exist. So imagine that there is 100% of some good or nebulous policy that we both want, but we both cannot have. And the more of it that I get is the less of it that you get, and vice versa. This could be the territory between our two countries, like what we were looking at with Ukraine and Russia. It could be oil revenues coming from an oil field that's between our two countries. Or, like I said, it could be something more nebulous, like geopolitical influence in our broader region. Well, I said a moment ago that both parties need to compare what they can get through a negotiated settlement to what they can receive by fighting a war. Let's start with the notation of a negotiated settlement. We're going to let X represent A's share of a settlement, and 1 minus X represent B's share of a settlement. You'll remember I said that 100% of a good is at stake between the two parties. Both parties want 100% of the good. That 1 represents 100%. X represents A's percentage that it is getting of that 100%, and thus the remainder is 1 minus X, or B's percentage of the good that B is getting through a settlement. So the more that A is getting in the settlement, the less that B is getting, and vice versa. Okay, we also need to think about what happens if they fight. We're going to use the variable P to represent A's expected outcome of a war. The reason that we use a P here is that it could be the portion that A gets by fighting, or if we assume a few other things about how war might function under these circumstances, it could equivalently be A's probability of winning. So that's why we get the P there. The key thing, though, is that just like before, there's 100% of the good at stake. So if A is expecting to win P portion of it, then B has to expect to win 1 minus P portion of it. You will notice that this is still zero sum. The more A expects to win, the less B expects, and vice versa. So A wants to be very powerful, but that's scary to B, and B wants to be very powerful, but that's scary to A. But simultaneously, note that war as a whole is not zero-sum. It is actually negative-sum. Because if you choose to fight a war, people are going to die, stuff is going to get destroyed, you're going to waste a lot of money, and we have to include the costs of fighting. So CA is going to represent A's cost of war, CB is going to represent B's cost of war. Both of those things are greater than 0. The only other restriction that we need to keep in mind here is that both X and P need to be values between 0 and 1, because as I said before, those things are percentages, so they are bound by 0 and 1. Now it's time to do just a small amount of math. The first question to ask ourselves is, when is A satisfied with a settlement? Well, remember that X is A's share that it gets in a settlement, and so A is going to be satisfied if the settlement is providing at least as much as what A expects to receive by fighting a war. So on the right side of the inequality, we have P, which is the amount that A expects to win by fighting, minus its cost of war, CA. So that right side of the inequality represents A's expected payoff for fighting, what it expects to get net its costs. The left side of the inequality is what it gets by settling, and so if the amount that you're getting by settling is more than the amount that you're getting by fighting, the settlement looks like a good idea. And I need to emphasize that on the eve of war, this is the exact type of thing that leaders are asking. They're asking their militaries, what's the likelihood that we are going to win? What is the cost associated with trying to do this? Is this going to work for us or not? What P represents is, how successful will this be? What the costs represent is how costly is it going to be for us to do this? What that X represents is what the deal is on the table. This is the type of thing that leaders do. They might not have it in the notation that we have, but I guarantee you that this goes on inside of the head of state's office in your particular country. They are looking at this and they are thinking to themselves, what do I get by fighting? What do I get by settling? And here we have a compact mathematical notation to represent that. We can do the same thing here for B. 1 minus X is what B receives in a settlement. And on the right side of the inequality, 1 minus P is the expected share that B gets by fighting a war, and minus CB is subtracting out its costs. So again, the right side of the inequality represents what B expects to get net its costs, and the left-hand side of the inequality is what B gets by settling. So B is going to be satisfied as long as the left-hand side is at least as large as the right-hand side. And notice that we can do a little bit of algebra, and this is like the most basic algebra possible, but the ones on each side cancel, and we can move the X over and flip the inequality and all that, and we get X less than or equal to P plus CB. A moment ago, when we were looking at A's payoffs, I said that this was the type of thing that A's leader would be thinking about. Well, it's also the case here with B. And it's literally the exact same thing here for B in the first line. All that we have done is switch out A's payoffs for B's payoffs, but it's literally the exact same thing at that point. Where things start to look a little bit strange is that second line. In that second line, we're asking ourselves, when is B satisfied? And our answer is when X is less than or equal to P plus CB. Well, you'll remember that X is A's share of a settlement. So why is A's share of a settlement appearing in the left-hand side of the inequality when we're asking ourselves when B is satisfied? Well, it is a simple answer. A settlement is zero sum. So the more that A is receiving in a settlement, the less satisfied B is, and vice versa. You'll notice in the second line, we have X less than or equal to P plus CB. So for B to be satisfied, X has to be small in that second line for this to work out. And that is reflecting how if A is getting a very small share of the good in the negotiated settlement, then B is going to be satisfied with that settlement. And what is defining that upper limit, the largest concession B is willing to make to A, is P plus CB. P being A's share of the expected outcome of a war, which is again zero sum. So the more A is expecting to get in war, the more B is willing to concede because B is not going to be doing well in the war. And the larger B's cost is, CB, the more, again, B is willing to concede because war looks relatively unattractive from B's perspective, and so it is willing to concede more to A to avoid war. If that is still unclear, it may help to look quickly back at the map and relate all of those variables and numbers to what we have seen before with the lines. Here, Ukraine is A, Russia is B, and instead of thinking about Ukraine as a strip of territory, we are thinking about it as a number line ranging from 0 to 1, 0 all the way to the west, 1 all the way to the east. P represents the expected outcome of the war, and so that is the white line. The space between the yellow and white lines are A's costs of war, and the space between the white and red lines are B's costs of war. So thinking about this as a number line, the distance between P and P minus CA is A's costs, and the distance between P and P plus CB is B's costs. You'll remember that B is going to be satisfied as long as the division is less than or equal to P plus CB. Well, that is saying that the division needs to be drawn to the left of the red line, and just as before, the red line was Russia's red line. Russia needed to have something to the west of the red line, and indeed, the numbering that we had previously is exactly capturing that. Now, in isolation, those two pieces of information are not particularly interesting. These are the types of things that leaders are going to do on a regular basis when there is a crisis. There is no deep insight there until we combine them together. So I've got both of those constraints on the screen put together up top. A is satisfied when X is greater than or equal to P minus CA, and B is satisfied when X is less than or equal to P plus CB. So if those constraints are simultaneously satisfied, then both parties are satisfied, and we should be able to convince them to settle rather than fight. Okay, but both of those things are in terms of X, so we can actually string them together as a single inequality. If we're looking at that center column here, we have P minus CA less than or equal to X less than or equal to P plus CB. That's what's going on with each of those individual constraints, and all I've really done is flip the direction of the inequality for when A is satisfied. But other than that, that is just putting those two lines together in that first line on the center column. So an X is mutually satisfactory when X falls between those two quantities. So really, the question for us to be able to find an X that is going to be mutually satisfactory is just a question of whether P minus CA is less than or equal to P plus CB. Because as long as that is the case, then we can find an X value that falls in between the two of them. And sure enough, again, through the magic of relatively basic algebra, those P's cancel out, we can add the C's to the same side, and our concluding statement is that we can find a settlement that is going to satisfy both of them, as long as CA plus CB is at least 0. So to annotate what we just did there, X is mutually satisfactory when it falls between P minus CA and P plus CB. Such an X value exists as long as P minus CA is less than or equal to P plus CB. And manipulating that second line is always true if CA plus CB is greater than or equal to 0. And you'll remember from before that the costs of war are in fact costly, so people are going to die, stuff is going to get destroyed. Individually, CA is positive, individually, CB is positive, and when you add two positive things together, what do you get? Well, still a positive number, which means that last line holds, which means there is always going to be an X value that is mutually satisfactory. Thus, what all of that algebra told us is that the work that we did drawing lines on maps in Ukraine was generalizable. It was not conditional on us just focusing on some sort of territorial conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It was not conditional on specifically where we were drawing the expected outcome. It was not conditional on how costly war was, as long as war was in fact costly. This generalizes to any circumstance. In principle, as long as war is costly, and as long as you can negotiate over the good at stake, there is going to be a settlement, and in fact a range of settlements, that are mutually preferable to war. Taken together, all of that algebra, all of those lines on maps, tell us something really important. Our recipe for war has two ingredients. Not one, two. And you need both, otherwise you do not get a war. Ingredient number one is a substantive disagreement. There has to be something that is in dispute between the two of us, that both of us want, but both of us cannot have simultaneously. If there's nothing in dispute, then there's no reason for us to fight a war. But what we just demonstrated is that alone is not good enough for a war. If there is a substantive disagreement between the two of us, then we should be settling short of fighting, because it would be in the best interest of both of us to have a settlement that roughly reflects what would occur in the event of a war, and then just put that into place peacefully, rather than fighting to get something relatively similar, because if we fight, we pay costs in the process. Circling back to a previous point, that means that if you have an individual who is just really obsessed with acquiring a whole bunch of land, and is willing to pay enormous costs to get that land, that still does not explain why a war occurs. Because if that person tries to fight to get land, in expectation, they're still only going to get something, and even if they are not internalizing the costs of war as being all that high, those losses are still losses to some degree, which, once more, means that the parties should be negotiating a resolution instead. Thus, we need something else in addition to that substantive disagreement. And that second ingredient is what I am calling a bargaining friction. Now, there are a bunch of different bargaining frictions that could go into place here as the second ingredient in the recipe. We'll be exploring a few of them with the back half of this video. We'll also see more in a future lecture when we start talking about leader-based explanations. But the substantive disagreement by itself is not good enough for a war to occur. We need to have a substantive disagreement and a bargaining friction. I have two additional points here. First, the vast majority of what you have heard about why wars occur previously in your life, if you go back to, for example, your high school history classes, those types of explanations focus on that first ingredient, substantive disagreements. You very, very rarely hear anything about the second ingredient, bargaining frictions, even though they are co-equal and you have to have both for a war to occur. Think back to some of the historical explanations that you've heard about wars before. Maybe start with the American Revolution. Why did the American Revolution happen? Well, the common explanation that you'll get there was that there was taxation without representation, that Americans were upset at the tax rates that they were being offered by the crown, and so colonists decided to fight a war rather than continue with that. Okay, sure, that's a substantive disagreement, but it does not explain why the war occurred. Think about all of the European wars that have been fought over territory, maybe like World War II, and actually that applies both in Europe and in the Pacific. Even if both sides want territory, that does not explain why wars occur, because you have to also explain what's going on with the bargaining friction. And for my final point here, this may sound like it's just an academic distinction again, but I assure you it is not. If you are in the business of trying to stop wars from happening, what this recipe tells you is that you actually have two options. You do not need to convince everyone in the world to suddenly start liking each other and agree on how the world should work. You do not need to do that to stop wars from happening, because you have this second outlet. If you can resolve bargaining frictions, then you don't get wars to occur. This gives you two legs to attack and not just one. Actually, I want you to keep that in the back of your head, because while this lecture is focused on why wars start, our next lecture will be on how wars end. And what we're going to be focusing on there primarily is how wars can help resolve bargaining problems. The key insight, again, for next time, will be that if you can have a war resolve the bargaining friction, you can have a war end short of military defeat of one side, thereby saving a bunch of casualties, even if that war itself does not resolve the substantive disagreement between the two parties. Well, if today's goal is to explain why wars begin, we still have not succeeded in that mission. And, in fact, we've made our lives more difficult by establishing war's inefficiency puzzle. We can't just say that wars begin because countries hate each other. We actually have to explain why they're choosing to fight instead of negotiate and save on the costs. So, the goal for the back half of this lecture is to give some answers to war's inefficiency puzzle. And specifically, we're going to be looking at three. These three answers are not exhaustive. In fact, the literature on crisis bargaining is huge. So much so that you could spend an entire semester learning about these things if you really wanted to. But because we're just trying to get a good introduction to crisis bargaining theory, we're only going to be focusing on three of the most common explanations. 1, power shifts and commitment problems. 2, asymmetric information. And 3, issue indivisibility. With each of these, we're going to take a look at an assumption that we made when we first established war's inefficiency puzzle. We are going to relax that assumption and see how relaxing that assumption and doing nothing else gets us to a situation where wars occur despite the fact there is mutual acknowledgement of there being settlements that both sides prefer to fighting. Now, that being said, by the end of this, I hope to establish that the first two answers are actually pretty good, but the third one is not so good. Issue indivisibility does not work out so well as a good explanation for war, because while it is true that it works in theory, the assumptions that you have to make about issue indivisibility don't really hold in practice. And that's interesting because I think among these three, that's the first one that people like to go to, especially in the community outside of academia that might try to do a little bit of news analysis about what's going on. Issue indivisibility sounds like it's really tempting as an explanation on the surface, but you drill down into it and it doesn't look so good. Okay, well, the first assumption that we are going to relax is the idea that the parties only have to negotiate once. We know from what we did with the repeated prisoners dilemma that states tend to last a pretty long time, and no matter what happens in negotiations right now, there's a very high degree of probability that both parties will be around next year and will have to negotiate once again. It turns out that relaxing that assumption by itself doesn't really change much. In a one-shot negotiation, because war is costly, the parties are already reaching an efficient outcome. However, if you combine repeated negotiations with shifting power over time, then you run into a problem. Take a look at how I have diagrammed this on your screen. We no longer have one expected outcome, we have two expected outcomes, and those outcomes are different as a function of time. On the left, we have a white line that represents today's expected outcome as a hypothetical situation. And on the right, we have another white line that represents the future expected outcome. So power is going to shift between the two parties over time. In the present, it appears that Russia is relatively strong, but in the future, compared to the present baseline, Ukraine will be relatively strong. We have talked before about how the best way to think through such strategic scenarios is to start at the end of an interaction and work your way backward. So let's apply that lesson right now and imagine that we are in the future, that power has shifted favorably to Ukraine, and that whatever happened in that initial round of negotiations, it went well enough that both parties agreed, and so there was not a game-ending war fought back then. What happens now that we have jumped into the future? Well, whatever negotiations took place before are irrelevant to the current negotiation. The reason being is that in that initial period of bargaining, both parties split the good, and they've enjoyed that good in that previous period. So whatever payoffs have accrued previously are already accrued, and there's nothing that you can do to change them once you are in the future, and you have to negotiate in the future. Well, in this future, again, power has shifted favorably to Ukraine. And what we learned at the beginning of this lecture is that it is beneficial to both parties to negotiate a resolution to this, and that the negotiated resolution has to be commensurate with the balance of power. Notably, it is whatever the balance of power is at the time of the negotiations, which, this being in the future, is something that is relatively favorable to Ukraine as compared to what was the case previously. Thus, in the absence of any other bargaining friction, we would expect the parties to reach a settlement in the future. Moreover, that settlement is going to be somewhat close to the white line on the right, because the white line on the right represents the balance of power between the two parties in the future. Think about this from Russia's perspective. The space between the yellow line and the white line on the right represents Ukraine's costs of war. In turn, the most that Russia could possibly hope to expect to get from a settlement in the future is everything east of the yellow line. That is because everything to the west of the yellow line is Ukraine's benefits from war net its costs, and as a result, Ukraine would fight if there was a settlement that was drawn any further west than the yellow line. Putting that together, again, the most that Russia could possibly hope to get from a settlement in the future is everything east of the yellow line. Maybe you can see where this is going, and how a bargaining problem is going to arise in the present. Once more, looking at this from Russia's perspective, if Russia fights a war today, the expected outcome of that conflict is the white line on the left. And perhaps as a consequence of fighting, if Russia is successful, Ukraine will be eliminated as a geopolitical entity, rendering the power shift in the future irrelevant because, again, Ukraine is no longer around. The downside for Russia is that war is costly, here being represented by the difference between the white line on the left and the red line. And so if Russia chooses to fight a war today, it does not actually get the white line on the left, it gets everything to the east of the red line. But you'll notice that the expected outcome of war today, net its costs for Russia, is still larger than the best possible world that Russia could be living in the future. And so if Russia cares a lot about the future, it is going to prefer to fight under today's circumstances, even though a settlement would be reached in the future. We call such wars preventive wars because a declining state is trying to fight to stop a rising state from becoming more powerful over time. One thing that's interesting about what we just discussed here is that to get a preventive war, you do not actually need to expect a war to happen in the future. Here, if we get to the future, we get a settlement. But the settlement is disadvantageous from the perspective of the declining state. And indeed, the declining state prefers fighting a costly war today to getting an efficient but disadvantageous settlement tomorrow. One thing that's interesting to note is that this all goes back to anarchy in some way. If you could write an enforceable contract over time that would sustain something close to the white line on the left, you would resolve this sort of problem. The declining state would have nothing to fear if the rising state were locked into a settlement that was roughly equivalent to today's expected outcome. But that doesn't actually happen in international relations. The rising state cannot credibly commit to upholding a settlement in the future if the rising state has become more powerful over time and is thus able to resist effectively what the declining state wants out of it. Consequently, preventive wars as a result of power shifts fall under a broader mechanism known as commitment problems. We have seen commitment problems before with the prisoner's dilemma. There, neither side could credibly commit to cooperating with one another, because when push came to shove, Each side, in a one-shot prisoner's dilemma, would prefer to defect. Here, it's the same story, except it's just one party that has the commitment problem. The rising state cannot credibly commit to upholding settlements that are centered around today's balance of power, because in the future, the rising state becomes more powerful and prefers fighting a war than continuing that settlement. Either way, we have a situation where the absence of a third-party enforcer to create some sort of system where there's a binding contract creates conflict and ultimately inefficiencies for both parties. Let me give you a few examples of what this looks like in practice. And we'll start with China, because there have been a variety of concerns about China in Western circles over the last 20 years. And what makes it particularly interesting is that expectations about the future balance of power pivoted strongly a few years ago. The long-running concern in Western circles was that China was growing as an economic power. And when you have more money and larger surpluses, you can take all of that and invest it in your military. And even short of upfront investments, the fact that China had a growing manufacturing sector meant that in the event that a war did start, China could quickly convert all of that manufacturing capacity from civilian goods to military goods. And so the conversation dominating these Western circles was how to navigate the rise of China. China was going to grow more powerful over time, and what we have seen all throughout this lecture is that the more powerful you are, the more concessions you can get in negotiations. So it was figuring out how to manage that power shift, knowing that things would be more favorable to China over time. And yet, sometime in the late 2010s, and definitely when you started progressing through the 2020s, the concern in the West actually flipped, where it was no longer a worry about China rising, but the fact that China may be plateauing and starting to drop off that became the greater concern. That if China starts switching into a declining state, then China may be aggressive in how it deals with Taiwan. It might see an opportunity to go after Taiwan and try to reintegrate Taiwan into Beijing's governance, and that opportunity may be fleeting. Oddly enough, the reason that China may be peaking right now is because it did too good of a job with its population control. Go back 40 or 50 years or so, and the government was very concerned about overpopulation in the country. And so the government instituted the one-child policy. And that, it turns out, worked decently enough. But put on top of that all of the economic growth that you have inside of China, what happens when people start making more money is that couples start deciding to have fewer kids naturally. And now we are in a situation where China's fertility rate is about 1.0 compared to the 2.1 or so that you would need for replacement rates. If you think that you need a large mass of humanity to effectively invade Taiwan, then, coincidentally, tick-tock for China. The sands through the hourglass are quickly falling. And it may be the case, say, 10 or 20 years from now, that there just aren't enough young men necessary to do that sort of invasion. Simultaneously, because so many couples are having one child, those couples become more reluctant to send that child to war. If that one child dies, then there goes the entire bloodline. There is no backup plan. So it's a double whammy here. China has fewer people to conduct the mission over time, and there is greater reluctance among the parents of the country to go ahead and send their children over there. Putting all of this together, there is great concern in the Indo-Pacific region that China sees its window of opportunity closing, and that if China does not take this opportunity in the next 5 to 7 years, it may never have the chance again. And that is the exact preventive war logic that we were looking at a moment ago. China is the declining state here. It realizes that in the future, when power shifts away from it, it is not going to be able to secure a peaceful settlement that looks particularly attractive. And so it feels that there is some sort of onus on it right now to fight, even though the war is going to be costly, because you could lock in something that is going to look relatively more attractive at the current balance of power. Moving on, there's another version of preventive war that can arise in coalition or alliance politics. One of the motivations, perhaps, for the October 7th attack on Israel was that Israel was in a period of time where it was normalizing relations with a lot of its neighbors. Well, Saudi Arabia would be the big fish in the pond there, and so you might be concerned if you are an actor in this region that is not favorable to Saudi Arabia or Israel about what would happen next if those two were to start working together. Well, what can you do if you're in that sort of situation? You might want to take actions that will stop those two parties from coming together. One way to do that would be to make a provocative attack on Israel that would put Israel in a situation where there is no way that it could not respond and engage in a much larger conflict against someone in that particular region, this here being Hamas. That undoubtedly would inflame tensions among Arabs in the region, and that would make it difficult for, say, the Saudi Arabian government to come to terms on an agreement with Israel. So, once again, you have a military action that is costly, that is meant to forestall a shift in the balance of power, because once that shift in the balance of power has happened, things are going to be unfavorable to you, and it may be worth paying the cost up front to try to lock in the balance of power as it is currently, rather than suffer the consequences of a disadvantageous peace later on. There are similar incentives at play between Russia and Ukraine as it relates to NATO. But I want to be very careful in how I am describing this, because NATO at its core is a defensive alliance. Article 5 has to wait for another country to attack one of the allies, for the ally to raise the question in front of the rest of the allies, and have the allies come to that attacked ally's aid. So you could think about a scenario in the future where Ukraine had joined NATO, and Russia starts trying to meddle in Ukrainian politics, or even worse, invades Ukraine. At that point, Ukraine would be able to trigger Article 5 and get massive assistance from the rest of the alliance. Think about that again from the perspective of the Kremlin. That looks like it would be a very bad thing in the future. If the Kremlin wants to be able to manipulate Ukrainian politics, it is really bad for the Kremlin if Ukraine joins NATO. Even if NATO is a defensive alliance and NATO is not planning to invade Russia at any point, in part because Russia has nuclear weapons and that would be a bad idea, but also because no one in Europe has a particular interest in conquering Russian territory. But that is not the central metric of whether a commitment problem arises. The thing that we need to look at is the difference in the expected outcomes over time. And if Ukraine joining NATO means that Russia can effectively not even touch Ukraine, then that is a very good outcome for Ukraine. But if in the present, without Ukraine being a member of NATO, Russia can in fact take a lot of Ukrainian territory, then we're starting to get that big difference in the expected outcomes of conflict that bring about a commitment problem. Let me give you an analogy that may help clarify the logic here. Imagine that you owned a retail store, and you heard a rumor that some criminal enterprise was planning on breaking in the next few weeks to steal everything that you had. Well, given that, you might start working to have more security measures around your store. You may hire security, you may install some cameras, you may install some alarms, that sort of thing. All of those are perfectly reasonable measures to take. But look at this from the perspective of the criminal enterprise. If the criminal enterprise learns that you started interviewing potential security guards and started looking for contracts for security alarms and security cameras, how is that criminal enterprise going to respond? Well, if they are dead set on trying to rob you, this is going to move up their plan. They now have a ticking clock, a closing window of opportunity. They want to get this robbery done before you have the opportunity to take those offensive measures. Well, that takes us back to 2022. There is an argument that Russia was looking at Ukraine getting closer and closer to NATO, as Ukraine being this business owner, and NATO being the security policy. And if Russia was dead set on trying to get stuff from Ukraine, the opportunity to do that would be not so good in the future once Ukraine had set up a situation with NATO, and looks more attractive now before that is the case. And so Russia feels like there's some sort of urgency here to invade today before things become worse. Another example that seems straightforward on the surface is with nuclear weapons. You might have one country see that another country is building nuclear weapons and try to stop that from happening. So in this case, the potential proliferator is the rising state, and the declining state is thinking to itself, if this rising state builds nuclear weapons successfully, then in the future, that rising state is going to have greater coercive capacity. They can scare me with these nuclear weapons, and they can better protect themselves at home. And I don't like either of those things, and so to stop that from happening, I'm going to start a war now. And indeed, we have a scattering of cases that look like this through history. Israel has a couple of famous examples, one in the early 1980s and one in the mid-2000s, where Israel bombed reactors first in Iraq and then later in Syria to try to nip those programs in the bud. Then, more recently, we had the United States attack Iran for similar reasons. Drop a bunch of bombs on Iranian nuclear facilities to prevent Iran from being able to progress toward its alleged nuclear weapons program. Now, you may remember that I said that this seems like a straightforward application, and the reason that it seems like a straightforward application rather than it is a straightforward application is because there's one slight complication here, which is that nuclear weapons do not grow on trees. If a country wants to develop a nuclear weapon, then it has to make an active decision to do so. It has to spend a lot of money on the nuclear program, it has to hire a bunch of nuclear scientists, it has to build a whole bunch of nuclear technology. And the reason this matters is because it raises the question of why a state would choose to build a nuclear weapon if it can anticipate that an opposing state is going to launch a preventive war to stop that from happening. Again, these nuclear weapons are very expensive, so it would be a very bad idea to invest a whole bunch of money in a program only for it to turn into a giant hole that's burning in the desert. And that is different from how we were conceptualizing the power shift previously, where we were just supposing that over time, the rising state was rising and the declining state was declining, without any real information about how that was happening. And so later on in this lecture series, we will look at situations that are closer to this, where we have the rising state having to make an active decision on whether to build a weapon or not, and think about an even broader question about whether you can negotiate over the weapons themselves. Finally, let's look at a more complicated application of this shifting power logic. Let's layer one war on top of another war. Imagine that a war starts somewhere, and we're not going to focus on why that started. We'll just assume that's happening for one reason or another. And you have a country that has geopolitical interests in both regions where one war is starting and one where another war may be starting. If the country commits to fighting the current war, then that shifts the balance of power in the second region should a war start right now, because this one country cannot necessarily balance both of those things at the same time. This is called a war of opportunism, where, for example, if the United States is very busy fighting a war in the Indo-Pacific because China has invaded Taiwan, then that might shift the balance of power over in Europe. From the perspective of Russia, this may be a window of opportunity. Russia now has a chance to go ahead and try to invade parts of Europe that it will not have the opportunity to again if the United States is ready to defend Europe. Now, for a long time, the United States tried to maintain what is known as a two-war standard, which is as it sounds. It is the idea that the United States should be able to fight two large wars simultaneously without facing supply or manpower shortages. That standard fluctuated over time, with the size of the war that the United States had in mind getting smaller and smaller. But the exact reason to have this two-war standard was to avoid a problem where the United States commits troops in one place, and that sparks other conflicts elsewhere because other countries see an opportunity to take advantage of the United States. Now, you might be wondering why I've had an image of NATO in the background during this entire discussion. And the reason is because the Hague Summit that occurred in 2025 was geared toward trying to resolve that problem. Because over time, that two-war standard for the United States dwindled to the point that the United States cannot adequately fight two wars at the same time, especially if one of those wars is against China in the Indo-Pacific. Well, that's a very frightening thought to anyone in Europe, because if a war starts in the Indo-Pacific for whatever reason, perhaps because China is seeing the window of opportunity close on the invasion of Taiwan, then suddenly that may very well mean that Russia starts a war inside of Europe. And so what we saw at that summit is the Allies agreeing to raise core defense spending of each country to 3.5% of GDP. And if the Allies do indeed spend to that level, then this opportunism situation might fade away, where even if the United States is fully committed to what's going on in the Indo-Pacific, Europe is strong enough to defend itself, and it doesn't have to worry about Russia invading as a consequence. Moving along, the next mechanism that we are going to look at is asymmetric information and miscalculation. Here, the assumption that we are relaxing is that everyone knows everything that is relevant to the situation at hand. We know what the balance of power looks like, and we know what each other's costs of war are. In practice, that might be a heroic assumption. You might have some secret information about how powerful your military is that I do not know. You may also have a better idea about how resolved you are over the issues. How much do you care about what it is that we are fighting over? That sounds like an internal characteristic of a leader, so it might be difficult for me as an outsider to know exactly how you feel about the situation. What I have diagrammed on the screen is a situation where one party, say Russia, is uncertain about what the distribution of power is between it and its opponent, here Ukraine. And Ukraine, in contrast, is informed of the situation, or is at least better informed of the situation. This is going to cause a problem for Russia as Russia is formulating its bargaining strategy. When everything is publicly known, it is relatively easy for Russia to formulate its bargaining strategy. It is going to think about what the expected outcome of the war is, which again is publicly known, and it is going to base its strategy around that. And hopefully, from Russia's perspective, push the settlement a little bit to the west of that expected outcome, and exploit the fact that Ukraine has costs of war that Ukraine would like to avoid. But Russia does not have the same luxury as Ukraine here. Ukraine knows something about the world that Russia does not, and as a result, in this simplified world that I've constructed on the screen, Russia knows that there may be one of two different possible expected outcomes, that again, Ukraine is informed about, but Russia is not. And given that, Russia has to choose between a couple of different options here. Option 1 is to hazard a guess that the situation on the left represents what the world is actually like, and Ukraine knows that in fact Ukraine is relatively weak. If that is the case, then Russia can make relatively onerous demands out of Ukraine and still get Ukraine to accept. That's because Ukraine just does not have a better alternative. Ukraine knows that it is relatively weak, and so when it sees those terms on the table, Ukraine still wants to accept as opposed to reject and pay the costs associated with war. The drawback for Russia here is that Russia does not actually know that the situation on the left is the true situation. And so if Russia makes such an onerous demand, there is some chance that the situation on the right is the real situation, and as a consequence, Ukraine will reject that proposal. That is because Ukraine knows that it is relatively powerful under these circumstances, and so Ukraine can do better on the battlefield than accept the onerous demands that Russia is making out of it. Retrospectively, this is going to look awful for Russia. Not only did Russia make large demands that Ukraine subsequently rejected, but now Russia is fighting a war, and moreover, that war is occurring under circumstances where Ukraine is relatively powerful. And to top it all off, because the war is being fought, Russia is also suffering its costs. So this is a disaster for Russia here. The alternative is for Russia to default to thinking that the situation on the right is the one that reflects the real world, and as a consequence, make a relatively conservative demand to Ukraine. The upshot for Russia here is that because the demand is conservative, it does not matter whether Ukraine is actually weak or strong. Ukraine will accept the proposal regardless, which means that Russia is guaranteed to avoid paying its costs of war. The downside for Russia, though, is that there is some chance that Ukraine is actually weak, and under that particular circumstance, Russia could have demanded more and gotten away with it. But because it went conservative, it does not have the chance to do so. The push and the pull that we're observing here is something known as a risk-return trade-off, and I guarantee you that at some point in your life, you are going to encounter a risk-return trade-off as well. Broadly speaking here, the more that you demand in bargaining, the better you are conditional on the bargained offer being accepted. But, simultaneously, the more that you demand, the less likely the deal is to be accepted. For example, imagine that you have received a job offer, and now you are negotiating salary. Well, the more that you demand in those salary negotiations, the happier you will be conditional on your employment. However, the more that you demand, the more likely the company is to say, no thank you, and for that company to go hire someone else. So when you're in those salary negotiations, you're going to have to figure out a number that is going to make you happy, but simultaneously is relatively likely to be accepted. You don't want to demand millions of dollars because there's no chance that you're going to get that. But simultaneously, you don't want to demand a $30,000 wage because while the company may be very happy to hire you at that, you are not going to be particularly pleased if you have a job at $30,000. Likewise, you might encounter a risk-return trade-off when you go try to buy a home. Maybe you tour a particular house, you like it quite a bit, and you need to put in an offer. Well, the larger your offer is here, now the more likely the offer is to be accepted. But simultaneously, the larger your offer is, the more you actually have to pay for the home. And so the trade-off there is trying to maximize your likelihood of getting an offer accepted while simultaneously trying to keep the price down. Well, it's the same thing with crisis bargaining. The more that you demand, the happier you are once the deal is signed. But simultaneously, the less likely the other side is to sign the deal. And if the other side rejects, you're saddled with your costs of war. We could sit down and calculate this if we wanted to. Russia could think about the marginal extra benefit it gets by making a larger demand, and weigh that against the marginal extra risk of Ukraine rejecting as a consequence of that extra demand, and also factor in Russia's costs associated with fighting, conditional on that rejection. But there are two straightforward features of how Russia should navigate its risk-return trade-off. First, if Russia's costs of war are really large, then Russia ought to be more conservative with its demands. That's because the downside risk of Ukraine rejecting looks scarier if Russia is paying a high price tag associated with that. The second big question is how optimistic Russia is about the situation. If Russia really thinks that the case on the left is very likely to be the real world, then Russia becomes more likely to make onerous demands. The reason being is that, from Russia's perspective, those demands are very likely to be accepted, and Russia gets a very good deal for itself whenever those deals are accepted. Combine those together, give Russia relatively small costs associated with war and relatively optimistic beliefs about its own strength, and Russia becomes inclined to make that onerous demand. And that is the situation that leaves open the possibility of war, because some portion of the time, Russia will be wrong with its assessment, Ukraine will reject, and you get a conflict. One extra note here, and connecting back to that earlier idea that irrational explanations for war are overrated. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about situations that look like this as a result of irrational behavior. That a leader just made a miscalculation and it's because the leader is stupid. Well, that's not true necessarily. And in fact, what we've just seen here is that a leader can have a perfectly rational miscalculation. The world is not full of complete information. There's a lot of incomplete information out there. Leaders are not going to necessarily know exactly how strong their opponents are and how resolved their opponents are to fight. And in the absence of having complete information about those sorts of things, leaders have to make best possible guesses. And sometimes, again, if you are optimistic because that's what your intelligence agencies are telling you, and your costs of war are relatively low, then you will make that onerous demand, knowing that sometimes it will backfire, but in expectation, it is the best thing for you to do. Look, if I offered you a bet where I flipped a coin, and on heads I paid you $20, and on tails you paid me $5, I suspect every single one of you would jump at the opportunity to play that game. And moreover, you would want to play that game as often as I am willing to play it. Nonetheless, if we played it once, I flipped the coin and it came up tails, you would be giving me $5, but it would be pretty bizarre for the rest of us to criticize you for wanting to do this. Yes, on the face of it, you are out $5, but that looked like a really good gamble, and if you had the opportunity to do it all over again, you would. Well, it's the same thing here with crisis bargaining. One big difference between that silly gamble and an actual war is that war is costly. That's the big theme of today's lecture. But because war is costly, there is common ground between the parties to try to find a resolution short of actually fighting. And that gives rise to a temptation to try to have communication resolve this sort of problem. Imagine that you and I are in a crisis bargaining scenario, and I know that I am privately informed that I am very strong. There's something that I know about my military, or I know about your military that you do not know, that leads me to understand that if a war is fought, I am going to do very well for myself, and you are going to do poorly. At the same time, though, I know that this is indeed private information to me, so you are unaware of it, which means that when we sit down at the bargaining table, I am anticipating that you are going to make very large demands, because you think that you're going to win, even though, again, I privately know that that is not the case. It is therefore reasonable to conclude that perhaps diplomacy might get us out of this situation. In other words, when we sit down at the bargaining table, before any final ultimatum is made, you and I can have a conversation. And I can say to you, look, I know what is about to happen. I know that you are really tempted right now to demand a lot from me and leave me with a relatively small offer. But here's the thing. I know that I'm very powerful, and I'm going to reject that proposal because I can do better by fighting a war instead. And that's bad for you too, because instead of actually us figuring out a way to resolve this problem peacefully and enjoy all of the benefits of not having to pay the costs of war, as soon as you make that large proposal, I'm going to reject, and both you and I are going to be dissatisfied with the final outcome because we're going to be fighting a war and we're going to be paying the costs associated with doing so. So look, make a small demand, and we'll both be happier as a result. We will walk away from this bargaining table with a good deal for both of us, and we'll both be happier than the alternative where you make a large demand, I reject, and we're both saddled with those costs of war. And if you knew that what I was saying was actually accurate, you would want to listen to what I am saying, because I just walked through the basic logic of crisis bargaining and war's inefficiency puzzle. Unfortunately, diplomacy is not so simple, and it is very easy for me to sit down at a bargaining table and tell you things that are not true, which may not be immediately clear to you. If I say something like, I am strong, if that is actually going to communicate meaningful information to you, it needs to also be the case that if I were actually weak, I would want to tell you that I am weak and that I am not strong. But that is not the incentive structure that crisis bargaining creates. Regardless of whether I am weak or I am strong, I want to convey to you a signal of strength because the proposal that you are going to give me is based on how strong you think that I am. The stronger that I am, the more concessions that you have to make to me. And whether I am weak or I am strong, I prefer getting more concessions to fewer concessions in a peaceful deal. So when I say that I am strong, I may very well be telling the truth. But just as easily, I could be weak and bluffing strength. And as a result, when I communicate strength to you, you cannot meaningfully update your beliefs about me and change what your proposal strategy is going to be in light of those comments. This does not mean that all diplomacy is worthless, and eventually we will see how you can meaningfully communicate information to another side. But it does place significant constraints on how you are going to convey that information. Now let me give you a quick illustration of asymmetric information and the risk-return trade-off in action. On the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was under the impression that Russia was going to do very well in the war, whereas Ukraine had some private information that Russia was not as well prepared as Russia itself thought, and as a result, Ukraine was more inclined to fight than make massive concessions to Russia, precisely because Ukraine thought that it would be able to do better in the war. Let me go into some greater depth there. What's fascinating about this particular case is that there was a knowledge gap inside of Russia itself. The Kremlin believed one thing, whereas soldiers on the ground knew another thing, and the information that Ukraine had was closer to what the Russian soldiers knew than what the Kremlin knew. You get these bizarre incentive structures inside of autocratic regimes, where going even from low to high-level bureaucrats all have incentive to report the good news to everyone above them, including all the way up to the autocrat. So you get a reporting structure where someone at the bottom of the hierarchy will report to the middle level that things are going great. People on the middle level are going to report to people at the higher level that things are going great, and people at the high level are going to tell the autocrat that, again, things are going great. When all through that hierarchy, you have corruption. Low-level officials are corrupt, mid-level officials are corrupt, high-level officials are corrupt. And there may be people in the system up and down the line that are frustrated with it. But to do something about it, you would have to report that to your superior, and that would involve a lot of work for the superior. And when you get all the way up to the top as well, now you're upsetting an autocrat in a place where there is relatively weak rule of law. And that's probably not a good place to be if you are a bureaucrat who wants to not only keep their job, but also keep their freedom and not be arrested or even worse. In a more open society, someone in this sort of position does have another outlet. They could go to the press, tell them what's going on, leak this sort of information, have the press reveal it, make it into a big scandal, and then force changes as a consequence of that. But this, again, doesn't really work in autocratic governments because autocratic governments will tend to control the press, and so there is a restriction there as well. And that was the basic problem that the Russian military faced. Even going back to Soviet times, there was a general acknowledgement of corruption being a problem. The issue was that resolving it was not simple. The situation following the 2008 Russo-Georgian War is particularly telling here. You will remember that Russia actually won this war for all intents and purposes. It accomplished the goals that it set out to accomplish at the beginning of the conflict. But like any good military, after the war was over, the Russian government decided to take a look at how the war was fought, do a post-mortem, and see if anything could have gone better. And indeed, in the post-mortem, there was disappointment that Russia should have actually been able to do this faster and cleaner than Russia did in practice. And the problem was corruption. So the Kremlin instituted some reforms to try to root out the corruption problem. But guess what happened to the person that was in charge of the task force? In a very Russian outcome, that person himself was arrested for corruption. There were further reforms put into place, of course, and by the time 2022 rolled around, the Kremlin had thought that it had fixed the problem, even though there was no way anyone inside of the Kremlin could be fully sure that that was the case. Nevertheless, because Russia was confident, you had stringent demands being placed on Ukraine. Russia thought that Russia was going to be able to succeed in the war, and therefore presented a position at the bargaining table that is commensurate with that. This gets especially crazy with what Ukraine knew. On the eve of the war, Russia mobilized a whole bunch of soldiers into Belarus with the plan to go south and invade Kyiv directly, the capital of Ukraine. Well, during that period of time, before the invasion actually started, Ukraine took the opportunity to send some special forces into Belarus and poke around. While there, the Ukrainian special forces were indeed able to verify that a whole bunch of Russian soldiers were in Belarus to do something, but the special forces were not particularly impressed by the quality of those Russian troops. The Russian troops had a tendency to go into the towns to go ahead and party and drink and that sort of thing, and to fund those activities, you would have the Russian troops siphoning off fuel from their tanks and other sorts of vehicles, maybe trying to peel off steel and armored plates from their tanks to sell for scrap metal, make a little bit of money, and then use that money for their festivities in the towns. And that is what gave Kyiv the confidence that if an invasion were to occur, there would be a good chance that Ukraine would be able to resist it. And in turn, there was no need to concede to the onerous demands that Russia was making at the time. Of course, we all know now that the Kremlin was miscalculating here, but I think the important lesson to learn is not only is this a great illustration of the risk-return trade-off and how uncertainty can cause war, but also that this is a rational miscalculation, that the Kremlin tried to do what it could given the information that it had, but the information that it had was rather poor because of the environment that the government had created as a consequence of concentrating power inside of the Kremlin and trying to restrict democratic reforms inside of the country. These were strategic decisions up and down the line. It is just that trying to obtain certain goals domestically inside of Russia had negative spillover effects for Russia's foreign policy planning. The final mechanism that we will look at today that answers war's inefficiency puzzle is something known as issue indivisibility. This relaxes the assumption that when the two parties bargain, they can divide anything in between the two of them in any way that they see fit. I can get 50% of the good, and you can get 50% of the good. I could get 25%, and you could get 75%. I could get 3%, you could get 97%. I could get 99%, you could get 1%, and so forth. We are free to fully move into that range from 0 to 100%, and again, any way that we see fit. It is pretty straightforward to understand why relaxing that assumption and restricting the bargaining space can lead to wars occurring. Think about the most extreme case, where the bargained good cannot be divided at all. In other words, I take everything, or you take everything, and there is no in-between. Well, the only way that we could avoid war under those circumstances is if at least one party has a negative value for fighting. If that is not the case, if we both have positive values for fighting, then one of us has to take the good in bargaining, But the person who does not get the good in the bargain settlement will say, no thank you, and prefer to fight instead, precisely because they have a positive value for fighting. There is also an interesting connection to anarchy here. If you had the ability to impose externally enforced contracts, this problem would go away immediately. You would simply take the relative probabilities that each of us would win the war and have some sort of randomization device decide who is going to obtain the entire good, and then we follow through on whatever the randomization device says and don't pay the costs associated with war. To keep this simple, imagine that it was a 50-50 shot between you and me winning. Then we flip a coin. On heads, I get the good. On tails, you get the good. And if we follow through on that, that is better for both parties than fighting the war, because flipping a coin is free, fighting a war is not. The problem with doing this, though, is that it is not enforceable. If I were to lose the flip, I am supposed to, if we follow through on the agreement, give you the entire good. But I am still perfectly capable of fighting you, and in fact, because I have a positive value for fighting, I would rather fight than follow through on the contract. And so the entire thing blows up. Once again, anarchy is creating inefficiencies in the international system. The indivisibilities do not need to be that extreme to still cause a problem. If the bargaining range looks like this, and the plausible places that you can divide the good do not fall within that bargaining range, then you are done. You could bargain and divide this in 100 different other ways, but if all 100 of those other ways are to the west of the yellow line or to the east of the red line, this is not going to work out, and you will have war occur as a result. This is a tempting explanation for why wars occur, but ultimately it is not a very good one. I say that it is tempting because you will often hear leaders say things along the lines of, there is no room for negotiation here. We need to have everything. This is a part of our homeland, and if we lose a single part of our homeland, the homeland is ruined and all of the value is lost. Thus, we must take everything in negotiations, otherwise we are going to fight. If you take that at face value, then yeah, sure, you have an explanation for war. But you only need to go back to the previous section to see a fundamental theoretical problem here. In environments of incomplete information, when one side knows something that the other side does not, that side with the private information wants to communicate as much strength and resolve as possible, because if that sort of communication is believed, they will fare better in negotiations. Well, claiming such indivisibilities is low-hanging fruit for trying to communicate that type of resolve. We need to have everything because we care so much about it. That's the type of thing that if you have asymmetric information and you know something that the other side does not know, if you want to communicate that strength, if you want to communicate that resolve, then the most resolved thing that you can say, the thing that communicates the most strength, is that we need to have everything because that's how much we value this. But that, of course, creates an incentive for less resolved types to make the same sort of claims, because even if they are less resolved, they would still like more of the object than less. And so all of this communication ultimately becomes meaningless. And perhaps you think that there may still be some objects out there that truly are indivisible, and will lose all of their value if you try to divide them in negotiations. So what I'm going to do now is give you a few examples where things look like they might be impossible to divide, and yet the parties do figure out a way to divide them, because the alternative is to fight a war, and war is costly. One of the two most common things people will point to with indivisibilities are islands. That islands are relatively small pieces of territory, and so even trying to divide them results in all sorts of practical problems that make them infeasible to divide. So one side has to get everything, and the other side has to get nothing in those sorts of negotiations. Well, if you think that is true, I invite you to visit Cyprus, or at least perhaps one half of Cyprus at a time, because Cyprus is indeed divided, even though it is an island. The other case that people will point to is a religious site. That religious sites are very, very important to the groups that are involved in the particular religion, and so they both might want this object that is at stake, and you cannot adequately divide it. Well, on your screen here, you have an old drawing of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This church is in Jerusalem, it still stands today, and it is the traditional site of where Jesus was crucified. So as you might imagine, anyone who is a follower of Jesus might find this particular site to be super important, and not the type of thing that you could easily negotiate over. I might want it, another Christian sect might want it, a third sect might want it, and so forth. Moreover, this type of site is so valuable that each of these groups might be thinking to themselves, well, if I fight, there is some chance that I win, and if I win, then I will take control over the church. Yeah, it will be costly to do that, but the church is so valuable that the costs are going to be justified. In other words, the payoff for fighting a war here is not negative, it is positive. And when you have multiple parties have positive payoffs for fighting, and the object is indivisible, lo and behold, you get war. Well, not so fast. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is actually divided. There are 6 groups that lay claim to various portions of the church, and then there are some communal spaces in the church that are so important that no one group controls them. Instead, they are just shared among all 6 groups. The reason that they have done this, of course, is that the alternative is bad. Fighting is costly, and especially here, if you are fighting over the church, there's a good chance that portions of the church or the entire church might get destroyed in that process. So it is better to figure out a division, a creative division at that takes something that is seemingly indivisible and making it very much divisible. The kicker for this particular story is that security is very important for the church, so you can't have any one of those groups control the keys to the church. And as a result, for more than 800 years now, a Muslim family has been in charge of the security and the keys to the church. Another problem for issue indivisibility as a cause of war is that even if you think a particular object truly is indivisible, it tends to be the case that warring parties, or would-be warring parties, are interested in more than just one thing. And as long as something else is liquid, you can continuously divide it, you can use that liquidity to solve the problem of the indivisibility with the other object. A great example of such a side payment comes from the Spanish-American War, an image of which you are now seeing on your screen. Over the course of the fighting, the United States successfully took the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico from Spain, while simultaneously kicking Spain out of Cuba. Well, at that point, the United States was done with the war as far as it was concerned. It had achieved its goals, and so there was no more point in continuing to fight. Spain, in contrast, felt differently. Spain believed that even though Spain had lost status quo control over those islands, Spain was still powerful enough to be able to retake at least some of that. And so continuing to fight was preferable to implementing what the status quo was on the ground. Let's ignore for a second my earlier point that you can, in fact, divide islands. Let's instead imagine that the Philippines could not be divided, that Puerto Rico could not be divided, that Guam could not be divided. Well, even under those circumstances, the United States found a clever solution to the problem. Spain cares about land, but Spain also cares about money. So if you cannot adequately divide the territory, why not instead write Spain a check? And that is exactly what the United States did. The United States wrote a $20 million check to Spain. Spain said, okay, I guess that works. And that is what ended the war. $20 million in today's figures is around $700 million, which is still relatively a bargain. But remember that what the United States was doing was buying out Spain's claim to the island, which is something that Spain may be able to acquire if Spain continues to fight. So if Spain only had a 15% or so chance of winning, what the United States was buying out was that 15% chance. Another great example of side payments comes from the War of Spanish Succession. The short version of this war is that the King of Spain died without a normal successor, and instead designated the grandson of Louis XIV to be the next King of Spain. This caused a bunch of consternation in other European capitals, because it meant that perhaps Spain and France would form a permanent alliance, which would endanger the rest of the continent. So Philip V becomes king, and this is the type of thing that might strike you as being a truly indivisible issue. It's very difficult to divide a kingship. Only one person can become king, so how could you possibly come up with a side payment for this? Nonetheless, after a long period of fighting, they did in fact figure out a way to institute a side payment. The perceived threat to the rest of the European countries was not just Spain and France forming an alliance, but also the collective power of France and Spain. So if you wanted to resolve the succession crisis, you could still give Philip V the throne, but simultaneously perhaps chop down the amount of value that Spain can extract out of having Philip V being the king. And indeed, to resolve the war, Spain had to make a bunch of territorial concessions. One of them you are actually familiar with even today. Think about Gibraltar for a second. That is an extremely important piece of territory with a lot of strategic value because it sits at where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Mediterranean Sea. If you look at Gibraltar on a map from a long distance away, it would appear to be part of Spain, but in fact it is British controlled. And if you've ever wondered why it's under British control, just take a look at Philip V. That is a concession that Spain had to make to get Britain to be okay with the succession plan. So, sure, Philip V can become king, Spain and France can get closer together, but some of the value that's associated with Spain and France becoming closer together is going to be lost as a consequence of Spain having to make a whole bunch of territorial concessions. Side payments in action, side payments are great because side payments can help us resolve wars that would otherwise be problematic due to issue indivisibilities. And that is where I'm going to leave you today. We have learned that as a consequence of wars being costly, there should be a range of settlements that are mutually preferable to fighting. And thus, if we want to understand why states fight wars, we need to understand why they are choosing to fight when negotiating should be, in theory, better for both parties. Well, we saw a couple of good answers. One was shifting power and the commitment problems that come along with that. And the other was asymmetric information, and one party being optimistic about its chances, but the other side being optimistic about its own chances. Then we had issue indivisibility, which works in theory, but has rather poor explanatory power in practice. As for what is next, if you are interested in one of those two mechanisms that worked out, then I have a couple of very long videos that go into depth on a couple of those cases. One is on shifting power and what is going on with Taiwan and China, and the other is asymmetric information and what went on in the prelude to the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. You can take a look at a couple of the links if you're interested in more on those. Other than that, the next time you will see me in this lecture series is when we talk about how wars end, switching the focus from why they start to why they finish. I hope to see you then, and in the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.